Hello and welcome back, and thanks for checking out the channel if you're new here. I'm going to talk about the murder of Charlotte Dymond, and it was an absolute brutal murder, and it was at the hands of her boyfriend Matthew Weeks. Now, it happened in 1844, a long time ago, and it was on, it was a Sunday of April the 14th. So this story still lives on to this day, and her body was actually found near Camelford in a stream at the actual bottom of Routor. It's a windy, desolate, lonely place, and it kind of sets the scene and the vibe. But ultimately, if you grew up in North Cornwall or spent time here, you may have come across this story, or more than likely. I came across it through being at school, secondary school, and to be honest with you, it was only the bare bones, basically, what I've just told you there, those actual facts. But it was enough to make an impression and stay with me. My wife has more information on the story, which she later passed on to me when I, became her husband, and we were talking about the subject, and obviously I realised there was more to the story. And just looking into the story a little bit more, there's more than what she actually knows as well. And I'll kind of pick up and discuss a few of those, issues and stories and facts that have surfaced to us, which makes us realise we didn't really know that much about the story in the first place. So Matthew Weeks worked on a farm as a labourer in Penhale, and the farm was owned by a widow and her son. Now, there was another individual that did work there as well, and his name was Thomas Prout, and he plays a very significant part in the story also. Charlotte Dymond, like I say, was working at the farm, and she's said to be quite flirtatious, well liked. So you can kind of already see that there could be problems in the relationship, because Matthew Weeks is always described as being, pockmarked, which obviously means he wasn't overly good looking. He walked with a limp or disability, as we'd call it in this day and age. And he was rumoured to be of short stature. So, coupled together, they were an unlikely couple, Charlotte Dymond and Matthew Weeks. But she was an illegitimate child, and Matthew Weeks had come into a small inheritance. So there is, fair reason to suspect it was kind of like a relationship based around those facts, and not solely dedicated to the fact that they were, or could have been in love. There is also one other individual, and that is John Stevens. He was in his 20s, the same as Matthew Weeks, and he was the Matthew Weeks' work companion on the farm. They all lived together on the actual farm, which was the custom of the day, because of travel, and you wouldn't have had easy access to transport to get to work. So quite often workers would actually live on the premises. The story gets slightly more mixed up and, shall we say, diluted, in the fact that Thomas Prout is actually a nephew to the farm owners. And as I will make it clear, he has a starring role in this story also. So John Stevens, who I've already stated worked with Matthew Weeks as his work companion, also was friendly with Thomas Prout, and he was later to recall that he overheard, or was told by Thomas Prout, that he could take Charlotte Dymond away from Matthew Weeks, whenever he wanted, as in, steal her affections away from Matthew Weeks. This, it obviously plays into the fact where the story is starting to get slightly mixed up now from its original concept of just a straightforward, straight, clear-cut case murder. There's beginning to get a lot of people and a lot of different interests in this particular story. Now that has led to the theory that there was a possibility that Thomas Prout and Charlotte Dymond were possibly going to elope together. That, is possibly based on John Stevens's words that he spoke about Thomas Prout, or what he said. But in any case, that yet again further adds a little bit, another dimension to the story, which, leads to open questions about the actual outcome of the trial. So on that April the 14th in 1844, everybody would have been in their Sunday best. For a Sunday back in those days, it was still considered a religious day, and people would have dressed up in their Sunday best. So, that also plays a little bit into the story. The last time Charlotte Weeks was seen alive, she was wearing a green dress and red shawl. And later that day, she walked out onto the moor with Matthew Weeks. Now, they were spotted by an elderly farmer, a gentleman that actually did state that he recognised Matthew simply through his limp in the fog. But he was convinced it was Matthew, and the second person was Charlotte. Later that evening, Matthew Weeks came back to the farm alone. That wasn't unusual, but Charlotte Dymond, after several days, had not returned. Now, people started to get quite concerned, and on top of that, they kind of noticed things were starting to not add up from Matthew Weeks' point of, the argument or point of view. And they also noticed some of his clothes were torn and muddied, and he actually stated he had not gone up onto the moor. Now, Matthew Weeks, by now was being questioned heavily by everybody, and, he actually was reported to have said that she'd been offered a position in Blisland, which was another kind of small little village hamlet miles away across the moors, and she was going to stay at an acquaintance's house. Now, obviously, John Stevens and the farmer actually went out to actually check this story out, but ultimately they could find no truth in that actual story, and that further compounded and added to Matthew Weeks's guilt, and and how people actually now were starting to look at this particular situation in regards to Charlotte Dymond being missing. Now, the farmer's wife, who took the clothes and did the laundry on the farm, also noticed that Matthew Weeks's clothes were torn, and indeed there was blood on the clothes. So that further compounded to the association to guilt through the evidence. Matthew Weeks, after a long time of all these things starting to mount up, pointing in his direction, he kind of left the area and eventually went to his sisters who lived at Plymouth. So eventually a search party was sent out, and it was organised pretty much by local people, and indeed a body was found, like we've just said, at the bottom of Routor, in the stream or river, half in, half out. And Charlotte Dymond's throat had been cut from ear to ear, and it is said that it looked like it had been done with 2 cuts or draws of the knife. So it was quite brutal, and it was done with a, you know, real intent and force and malice. It was from ear to ear. And yeah, her body was found, you know, half in the water and half out. And on that, you know, being discovered, the body, a search was then sent out for Matthew Weeks. And after, you know, a long search, they did actually find him in Plymouth at his sister's, and he was arrested and charged for the murder. Now, they did actually find some of her possessions, you know, in Matthew Weeks's room, so that also further added to his, you know, association to guilt. So things weren't looking very good for Matthew Weeks. And in the subsequent weeks leading up to the actual trial, you know, the media and, you know, the papers, and indeed, you know, common consent actually did convict Matthew Weeks before he even had his trial. Such was the public outcry of, you know, sheer disgust at what had happened in a rural community, and, you know, the way it was done, and in the circumstances, and the fact, you know, it was on a, you know, a bleak, lonely, cold, windswept area. It caught the public imagination, and it all added to the fact that Matthew Weeks was guilty before he even had a trial. Now, Thomas Prout, he didn't actually go out on that search, which people have questioned, and you know, subsequently after the trial, people have kind of looked back and asked, you know, about his actions. Like I said, he never went out to look for Charlotte Dymond in that particular search. You know, he actually, you know, did not like Matthew Weeks. In fact, John Stevens, he actually hated Matthew Weeks. And, you know, you have to draw the actual, you know, the actual thought process, you know, was there a cover up for any of these various people and their actions that would actually lead to have the finger fully pointed at Matthew Weeks? I mean, Matthew Weeks, he had an inheritance, as I've just said, and, you know, he used to dress just that little bit better and more finer and more flamboyant than his ordinary co-workers, and that kind of aggravated them. And, you know, he did have a lot of dislike aimed at him. So, you know, there were a lot of people that did not really have his best interests at heart. There is lots of other small things that don't quite stack up. I mean, Charlotte was dismissed from service, you know, 3 weeks before her murder, and, you know, in those days, if you were dismissed from service, you pretty much packed your bags and left there and then. There was no compassion. It was just, you know, the way things were back in those days. So people have questioned, how was she still at the farm and the actual residence 3 weeks after she'd been told her service was no longer required? Now, there has been, you know, speculation due to Charlotte being quite flirtatious and well liked, that perhaps she won over the affections of Miss Peters, the farm widow who was the employer, won over the affections of the son himself, and, you know, he was able to, you know, persuade his mother to keep her there just that little bit longer, you know, for whatever bizarre reason. This is all speculative, but it's still out there, and people have, you know, speculated that that could be one of the reasons she was still there. Now, Thomas Prout was, you know, supposed to meet Charlotte. It came to light in the church on that very night that she did not come back from walking up on the moor, you know. So what was that involvement? You know, did she actually make it to see Thomas Prout? And an alteration happened there. You know, we assume that Matthew Weeks, you know, in a jealous rage or fit because she was flirtatious, killed her on the moor. But you know, it could work easily for Thomas Prout. Now, when Thomas Prout was called to the stand when the trial was happening, by all accounts, he wasn't heavily cross-examined. You know, in fact, it was a pretty lackluster, weak affair. You know, and you know he wasn't fully, you know, tested. You know, so you know that in itself really, you know, also gives you the impression that Matthew Weeks, could he have been a full person? You know, because back in those days, you have to understand the political class, the social structure, you know, and Thomas Prout was a nephew to Mrs. Peters, who actually owned the farm. So in their social circle in that particular area, they would have been well-known, prominent people, and indeed, you know, that class, were they looking after themselves by pointing the finger at Matthew Weeks? Obviously, it was trying to move the blame from that social structure down to a slightly lower working class person. Now, a local man did actually state that he saw two people going up onto the moor through the fog and mist. Now, he was able to recognise Matthew Weeks by the limp and the gait. He couldn't recognise them by vision, by seeing them. He and his evidence was just based around the fact that he recognised the gait. Now, that, you know, is pretty circumstantial. Just throwing it out there, somebody had a little bit too much to drink, making their way back home. You know, another person with a disability or an illness, that's not out of the, you know, the realms of possibility, particularly back in that particular day and age. But that his evidence as well was enough to help convict Matthew Weeks. Ultimately, his conviction was very swift and very fast, and I believe it was less than half an hour he was actually convicted of killing Charlotte Dymond. Now, you know, all the evidence and that is stacked against Matthew is there, but on top of that, you have all those other questions that still remain unanswered to this day, and those questions do actually lead people now to believe, was Matthew Weeks the actual killer of Charlotte Dymond? You can actually go to Bodmin Jail where he was hung, and they do have a mock courtroom where you can listen to the evidence, you know, and the trial, and at the end of it there are buttons guilty or not guilty. And interestingly, the people running the actual jail say most of the people do press not guilty. There's other things that a supposed confession or a letter stating his guilt, you know, it has been, you know, or was written. But there's several problems with that. Matthew Weeks was, you know, illiterate, which isn't unusual yet again for a farmhand. Now, if you put that to one side, you can then say that somebody else would have written his words. The letter in itself, if you read it, it's not worded as a farmhand would have worded it. It has been, by and large, and most people would accept, be from somebody else's hand. And Matthew Weeks would not know, because he could not read, you know, or write what was actually being put on that piece of paper. So that there is a piece of evidence that people do say, you know, proves his suspect guilt, you know, yet again. The actual, you know, Matthew Weeks's, you know, legal defence team if you want to call it that, for that time period. It has also been stated that, you know, they didn't seem to be putting up a massively hard fight on his behalf. It was pretty lackluster. So, you know, yet again, those lawyers would have come from the same, you know, social circle and kind of, you know, class system that that Mrs. Peters would have operated in herself. And there was also the fact that Mrs. Peters, Thomas Prout was the nephew, and it all kind of, you know, if you look at it, it mixes up to add even more suspicion to Matthew Weeks' conviction. So we can also deduce that that a lot of people, you know, because of how it was reported through the media at the time in the papers, you know, there was a frenzy. Indeed, you know, 20,000 people come to see him be hung. And this is back in 1844. So you've got to imagine that this was a big news event. And, you know, ultimately that did in itself convict him and cause his a guilty conviction. So ultimately, Matthew Weeks was convicted of her murder, and you know, he was hung at Bodmin Jail. Now, the thing with that is that a lot of folklore has arrived and or derived from this particular story, such as, you know, it didn't really end that well for other people involved. I mean, the actual, you know, Thomas Prout, he only really lived a year after Matthew Weeks being hung. He had an illness which people said was like, you know, which had like water on the lung or in the body, you know, and, you know, obviously people draw the comparison with water on or fluid within the body, you know, representing the fact that Charlotte was found in the stream, or half of her body was submerged in the stream. There's also Matthew Weeks, when his, you know, coffin was being put in the grave, that it floated because the actual grave was flooded. You know, yet again, the parallel, the folklore about it, you know, sort of mirroring her death within the waters, you know, of the stream. So, you know, you've got all this folklore going on and paranormal activities. I mean, Matthew Weeks is supposed to haunt Bodmin Jail. You know, apparently he roams the corridors and the rooms of Bodmin Jail, you know, because he's eternally seeking justice. And on top of that, Charlotte Dymond is supposed to roam the moor looking for the true killer, some locals will say, you know, stating or indicating that Matthew Weeks was not the killer, possibly, that she's still, you know, till the name is, you know, brought forward, that of the true killer, she can't rest. And other people just state that she roams on the anniversary of her death just because she's locked in this world due to the brutality of her murder at the hands of Matthew Weeks. So it's a little bit of a variation on how she's you know, still roaming this world eternally. But, you know, as you can see, you know, there are lots of folklore and, you know, paranormal activities surrounding this. And indeed, one team did actually go and try to make contact with Charlotte Dymond. And, you know, and as one person online did actually say, it's a bit suspect because they only stayed in their car. But apparently over their means of contacting, you know, the people on the other side, Thomas did actually come through as the name. So obviously you can draw your conclusions of Thomas Prout, possibly. But, you know, this is all suspect and it's all thrown out there. But, you know, there are, you know, other bits of folklore, like in the church there was a written piece stating that, you know, when Matthew Weeks was hung, his, you know, soul would, you know, fly over the tors as a buzzard and then drift down to the river and meet up with Charlotte Dymond's soul, where they would be eternally together. Now, that would kind of suggest that Matthew Weeks did have some supporters and it wasn't all one-sided. And, you know, there is belief that, you know, that he wasn't totally guilty. And there were people even at that time thinking, you know what, perhaps this guy isn't the actual murderer. People did actually, you know, state in the community that, you know, after the trial, even when Matthew Weeks, it was done and dusted, that Thomas Prout, you know, wasn't really the person that they wanted to be around and associate with, because obviously they would have said if you'd stayed away, none of this would have happened, you know, if you hadn't interfered with Charlotte Dymond and Matthew Weeks. So even if they did blame Matthew Weeks for the murder and weren't excusing him, they did kind of still hold some venom towards Thomas Prout. Because obviously if he hadn't have been interfered within the relationship, Charlotte Dymond wouldn't have been killed. But was it Thomas Prout? And what conclusions can you draw from this? Everybody has their own thoughts and that, and I'll just run by my few thoughts on this, bearing in mind some of the evidence you can find online. And obviously I urge you to go online and look up this story. You know, there's a lot of fact with it, and there's a lot of mystery, and like I said, folklore and legend has arrived from this particular story, so it's well worth checking out. But I'll just give you my thoughts on it. I certainly believe Charlotte Dymond did enjoy you know, the attention that she may have received from the opposite sex, and I've no doubt, you know, living on a farm with Matthew Weeks and John Stevens, that you know, there was possibly a little bit of a love interest going on with John Stevens, even if it might not have been reciprocated by Charlotte. I think, you know, she might have give off signals to John Stevens, and that may be one of the reasons why he hated Matthew Weeks, you know, as much as he did. Matthew Weeks had one thing going for him, and that was an inheritance. Now, it may not have been a big one, but back in those days, it may have been enough to see a girl of Charlotte's social status gain just that little bit more of a foothold up the ladder and ease her life and her expectations of having to work so hard, you know, through her life. You know, ultimately, you know, I'm not suggesting she was a gold digger, but I'm suggesting that she would have been socially aware and would have possibly been able to, you know, understand manoeuvring herself, you know, into male people's affections, might have been able to ease her passage further in life. Now, the nephew, Thomas Prout, obviously that stands to question inheritance and possibly money there. So she would have possibly been able to understand, you know, possibly a relationship with him may have worked to her advantage. Now, I'm not sure Thomas Prout may have had her best interests at heart, and he may have just, you know, seen her as a servant girl to be used and abused. But ultimately, you know, that does still put him in the frame. Me personally, I have big reservations about the gentleman who was the last person to see them going up on the moor, the farmer, before he rode off on his horse. I mean, stating that he saw Matthew Weeks and Charlotte Dymond going up, he was the last person to see them alive, or see Charlotte alive, shall I say. You know, did he see Matthew, or did he just see Charlotte? You know, that's a question in itself. Was there another love interest for Charlotte? When you sit and think about it, I strongly suspect it probably wasn't Matthew Weeks. I personally don't think it was Thomas Prout. I do believe he acted, you know, immorally towards Matthew and indeed Charlotte, and it was probably a bit of a game for him. John Stevens, I think he was possibly, you know, jealous of Matthew Weeks, working with him, and, you know, wishing he had the affections of Charlotte fully. But did he kill? I'm not so sure. The farmer who saw her, I have, you know, reservations that it was, you know, him, but I do believe that it was possibly somebody else that she may have had a relationship with, or somebody who was wanting a relationship with her. I do think, you know, that the farmer, you know, where I've just said I don't think it was him, but for me, I strongly suspect he would possibly be my candidate as being the last person to see her alive. Now, that may not fit well with other people's deductions, but it just kind of fits my train of thought, how people would have been and worked and lived, you know, during that time period. And I've tried to put myself in their mindsets and how they would have operated. But yeah, so I believe it was probably the guy who last saw her, you know, saying that he saw Matthew Weeks with her. Basically helping point the finger away from himself. And ultimately, till some evidence comes forward, perhaps, you know, a building renovation on an old building where somebody knocks a wall down and perhaps there's a confession, you know, stuffed in between the cracks of an old wall, or somebody knew something that, you know, and they've got that written on paper. We will never know. But yeah, the murder of Charlotte Dymond is pretty brutal, and it's definitely worth checking out all online and digging up the evidence and digging up, you know, your thoughts and feelings on it, because it will definitely suck you into the actual story. And indeed, you know, her grave is, you know, was an unmarked grave. It had no headstone. But many years passed and a local farmer did actually pay, you know, a sum of money to actually have a headstone, which raised a few eyebrows at the time. And then there was another person who fell in love with the story of, an author fell in love with the story of Charlotte Dymond, got sucked into the story and the tragedy, the romance of it. And indeed, he had his ashes scattered on the area where her memorial is. So, you know, yet again, you can see it sucks people in, and it kind of, you know, there's a lot of mystery still out there surrounding this murder. So I'm going to draw it to a close here, and I bid you farewell, and yeah, go and check out the murder of Charlotte Dymond. It's definitely worth looking into the story, and it will suck you into it. All the best. Cheers.